We've seen this in the Chinese playbook before, slowing down processes related to trade in specific industries. They did it to Japan in a dispute with them. They did it to the Philippines, and they made life difficult for Norway and the UK at different times when they were having political disputes over a number of issues. So it could well be a deliberate strategy to apply pressure to Australia. And of course, we had that threat from Australia's Chinese ambassador recently that there would be pressure put on Australian trade. The argument that Australian farmers have made is that the measures we apply to things like our barley crop shouldn't attract the kind of tariffs that China is talking about putting on, up to 80% in some cases. But we'll have to see whether this widens out to other sectors and other measures.
And of course, what the response will be. We've got US Congress supporting Australia on barley. This is the other key question. To what extent will it actually hurt the Australian economy, or what alternatives will be found?
Yeah, and it was good to see a letter from a number of a bipartisan group of US congressmen and women, broader than just the Australia caucus. This has been a new feature in the relationship, an effort to have good congressional support for the alliance, to see figures like Senator Marco Rubio, Cory Gardner, who's very influential on Asia issues and Asia trade and security issues, sending that letter to our ambassador in Washington, Arthur Sinodinos. That's a good sign. But of course, it comes down to what the president wants to do when it comes down to trade policy. And we haven't seen yet a show from the White House of strong support for Australia in any sort of trade dispute with China.
It's interesting looking at what's happening with the impact of coronavirus right now. We talk about Australia's defence strategy, which was already in a state of flux, if you like, a bit of a transition. That's going to be accelerated. We look at number one with a bullet perhaps on the impacts, and that's the US-China strategic power play, call it what you will. That yes, China was part of the cover-up here, but it's the US that looks like it will be more weakened. And not just the US, you can look at Indonesia possibly as well.
Look, it's changing the geostrategic balance, that's for sure. Indonesia is a great example, a strong economic trajectory. How it comes out of coronavirus will be interesting. It's had some difficulties in managing the disease, and it's had some political difficulties in managing the disease as well, with some internal friction over the way government has responded and the extent to which they've been willing to openly and transparently confront the problem. It is having a very sharp impact on US-China strategic competition. We are seeing a much sharper discussion of China in the US than you would have thought possible 3-4 months ago. And for China, it will have an economic impact. Not only will China see a decrease in demand in a country that buys its goods because of the economic downturn generally, but they will see that move to shift manufacturing away from China to decrease our dependence on China. And that will have implications for their economy.
I wonder if there's one element which this really won't suit China. If you think of China's strategy, it was this slow power creep. Think of the red lines, for example. They said they wouldn't cross in the South China Sea. They crossed them. There are no implications. They plough on. The world almost like the frog in boiling water, if you want that analogy of it slowly getting hotter and the frog never quite jumping out until it's killed. Could this actually bring things to a head quicker? You've got the coronavirus inquiry, for example, China pushing back, and countries that maybe in 10 years might have said, well, we can't support it. Now they'll just say, well, we cannot possibly sit by with China such a threat to the world and not support this inquiry.
Well, I think the challenge internally for China is whether they can maintain the political compact of rising living standards and continuing economic growth in exchange for a very high degree of state control. And we've seen already some degree of protests in China during the last couple of months over how the crisis has been handled. But also there's been some protest and dissent about the economic responses of the Chinese government. So if Chinese GDP shrinks, if its growth shrinks dramatically, that could challenge the domestic political compact in China. And externally, the big question countries will be asking themselves is, can we trust China? And that's really what the inquiry that Australia has suggested is aiming to get to the bottom of. Because if we're going to reopen our borders to Chinese citizens, we need to trust that they have the virus under control and that we can trust their public health measures. And there's a big question mark over that at the moment.
And just finally on the White House, 2 staffers now testing positive. We're going to see masks being worn around the White House, quite the symbol, if nothing else.
Look, the president and the vice president have resisted wearing masks. They haven't wanted to do that. Now the order is through the White House that you need to wear your mask unless you're sitting at your desk in an office on your own. It's a small space, as anyone who's been there knows, tight corridors, pokey rooms, having 2 members of the administration staff.
So we're nearly out of time, James, but do you think Donald Trump will wear the mask walking through the White House?
Look, I think it's safe to say he will be the last person in that building to put the mask on, but there's 11 Secret Service agents in that building at the moment that have tested positive for coronavirus. So he's a notorious germaphobe. He won't want to take too many risks.